point of no return. At the same time, the US has reminded Seoul that they expect all UN member nations to continue fully implementing those sanctions until the regime gives up its nuclear weapons. We'll look at the implications of these slightly contrasting statements later in the show. But first, let's catch up with the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Centre. Devin.
Hi, Jung-ho. We'll start with President Moon, who's in France right now as part of a 5-nation tour. He met with the French president on Monday, and they discussed ways to improve their country's bilateral relationship. Our Blue House correspondent, Hwang Oh-jun, reports.
President Moonjae-in and his French counterpart President Emmanuel Macron have pledged to enhance the cooperation between their countries, elevating their comprehensive partnership to a new level. According to the joint declaration made by the two leaders on Monday, South Korea and France's foreign ministers will hold annual strategy talks and high-level talks between Seoul's foreign ministry's representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs and the French foreign ministry's political director will take place at least once a year. South Korea's and France's defense ministers will also hold regular talks to discuss regional security and possible cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. The two countries will promote exchange programs for training commissioned officers and hold joint military exercises as well. To strengthen cooperation in science and new technologies, a new dialogue system will be established between Korea's Ministry of Science and ICT and France's Ministry of Higher Education, Research and Innovation. The two leaders also decided to promote increased investment between the two countries while supporting their small and medium-sized businesses and startups to expand to each other's country. Seoul and Paris will also continue cultural exchanges and cooperation in areas including but not limited to visual arts, music, design, comics, food, and movies. Considering South Korea's successful hosting of the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and France's hosting of the Paris Summer Olympics in 2024, the two countries will continue its cooperation in the sports sector to promote peace and reconciliation. The Korea-France Sports Festival, which was first held in Korea in September 2018, will also be held in 2019. Presidents Moon and Macron also agreed to strengthen dialogue and cooperation to respond to the urgency of environmental issues, such as responding to climate change and protecting biodiversity. Hwang Oh-jun, Arirang News.
And on Tuesday, President Moon will be sitting down with the Director-General of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay, for the first time since she took office last year. In their meeting, the president is likely to ask that the Director-General support the expansion of inter-Korean exchanges and the establishment of peace on the Korean Peninsula. That meeting will wrap up the president's 4-day state visit to France, after which he'll leave for Italy late Tuesday evening local time. And when the president gets to Belgium the following day, he'll be taking part in the Asia-Europe meeting, or ASEM. On the sidelines of that, the presidential office has confirmed the South Korean leader will be meeting bilaterally with the prime ministers of the UK, Germany, and Thailand. The president's 9-day trip to Europe will have taken him to 5 countries. It wraps up on Saturday, and he'll be back in Korea on Sunday local time. The first 3-way meeting between South Korea and North Korea and UN Command is taking place at the inter-Korean border village of Panmunjom today. The officials are discussing the demilitarization of the joint security area as agreed upon at last month's inter-Korean summit in Pyongyang. According to South Korea's defense ministry, the closed-door meeting is being attended by 9 officials, 3 each from South and North Korea and UN Command. In Parliament, the floor leaders of South Korea's 3 negotiating bodies have agreed on the makeup of 6 temporary special committees that will be handling key policy issues. Under the agreement, the committees on political reform, judicial reform, and inter-Korean economic cooperation will have 8 members from the ruling Democratic Party, 7 from the main opposition Liberty Korea Party, and 2 from the minor opposition Bareunmirae Party. The other 3 committees will have a similar ratio, with the ruling party getting the most seats. The parties agreed to submit the final list of their members for each committee by Wednesday. Also on Wednesday, they agreed to hold a plenary session to vote on the 3 candidates they nominated for Constitutional Court Justice. And we're now into day 5 of the National Assembly's audit of government ministries and agencies. Up for debate today is the minimum wage hike the government enacted earlier this year as the Labor Committee inspects the Minimum Wage Commission. The ruling party says the double-digit percentage increases for this year and the next were necessary to raise the incomes of those who make the least money, while the opposition is calling for a slowdown and for different rates of increase depending on the industry. In the audit of the Finance Committee, temperatures are flaring as rival parties inspect the Korea Public Finance Information Service. That's the agency from which opposition lawmaker Kim Jae-chul had obtained and disclosed documents about the fiscal budget and other state statistics that the government claims were confidential. At the Industry Committee, the government's drive for nuclear-free energy was the subject of debate once again. The ruling party says it's for the safety of the people and that it's a global trend. But the opposition party says going nuclear-free has turned even a profit-making company to a deficit, referring to the Korea Electro-Power Corporation that was under inspection. Newly released figures from South Korea's central bank show that prices for both exports and imports went up last month. In large part on both ends, it was because of higher oil prices. Kim Hye-sung has the details.
Korea's export and import prices both rose in September on rising oil prices. According to the Bank of Korea Tuesday, import prices in September rose sharply by 1.5% on month, near 10% on year, recording their highest level since November 2014. Korea's benchmark Dubai crude soared 6.5% on month to an average of $77 a barrel last month. Imports of consumer goods and intermediary goods went up slightly, and raw material prices jumped 4.5% on month.
Global oil supply from OPEC and U.S. shale gas wasn't enough to meet demand, which has increased on recovering global growth led by the U.S. With U.S. sanctions on Iran set to come in this November, oil prices could go up further this year.
Export prices also went up 0.3% on month, while the local currency remained steady at around 1,121 Korean won against the greenback. Rising coal and petroleum goods prices led the gain in industrial goods prices, which went up 0.3%. Prices of agricultural and marine products rose 1.2% on month on higher prices of frozen marine exports. Export and import prices affect future consumer prices, so this could mean higher inflation in the months to come. Kim Hye-sung, Arirang News.
After a case of Middle East respiratory syndrome, or MERS, was diagnosed in Korea last month, the country has now declared itself free of the disease. It was the first time MERS was found in Korea in 3 years. World Health Organization rules say a country is MERS-free after 28 days without a new case. Yoon Jung-min reports.
The Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention made the official declaration as the clock struck midnight. According to the KCDC, the announcement was in line with guidelines set by the WHO, which requires that no new infections be reported for a minimum of 28 days, which is twice the length of the virus incubation period. This comes as one person was diagnosed with MERS in September after returning from a 3-week business trip to Kuwait, becoming the first confirmed case of MERS in the nation since 2015, an outbreak which resulted in 38 deaths. On September 21st, the KCDC lowered its alert level to its lowest readiness posture as 21 people who came into close contact with the initial patient all tested negative. MERS is a viral respiratory disease with a fatality rate of 20 to 46% and is caused by a novel coronavirus carried by camels. It can spread when someone is in close contact with the patient for a sustained period. Experts say in order to prevent MERS spreading, it's important to wash your hands thoroughly.
Because colds and MERS can be spread through handshaking or rubbing your eyes or nose, you can prevent the spread of the virus by washing your hands often.
The first MERS case was recorded in Saudi Arabia, and it has since spread to numerous other countries. As of June this year, the WHO has reported over 2,000 confirmed cases of the virus. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
President Moonjae-in held a summit with the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, on Monday in Paris. In the joint press conference afterwards, the South Korean leader seemed to urge France and other world powers that lifting sanctions on North Korea will need to be considered to encourage the regime to stay committed to denuclearization. Our Blue House correspondent Shin Se-min, travelling with the President, reports from Paris.
Meeting his French counterpart for the second time since taking office, President Moonjae-in pressed the need to loosen international sanctions on North Korea when and if the regime takes practical steps towards giving up its nuclear program. At their summit in Paris on Monday, President Moon called on European countries like France to play a role in encouraging the regime to continue on the path to peace.
북한이 핵을 내려놓으면 내려놓을수록 또 다른 한편으로는 북한이 핵에 의존하지 않고도 북한의 안정을 보장받을 수 있다라는 신뢰를 줄 필요가 있다고 생각합니다. 북한의 그 비핵화 조치가 마지막 올바른 선택을 한 것이라는 믿음을 국제사회가 주어가면서 북한이 빠르게 비핵화를 할 수 있도록 이끌어내야 한다고 생각합니다.
French President Emmanuel Macron said international sanctions should remain in place until the regime has fully and finally abandoned its nuclear program. However, the French leader said his country was willing to provide a helping hand if the North backs up its words with action.
As a nuclear state ourselves, France is ready to contribute on a technical level to help the denuclearization process. We have a range of expertise in the nuclear field which, in terms of denuclearization, would be useful, and we can offer that if needed.
Besides North Korea-related diplomacy, the two leaders discussed a range of other issues. They agreed to expand bilateral trade and investment between South Korea and France. And they committed to joint efforts on fostering new growth engines in the fourth industrial revolution through cooperation in the fields of science, technology, startups, and SMEs. They also decided to hold their next summit in Seoul after President Moon extended an invitation to Macron. A comprehensive upgrade from existing relations in security, economy, and culture, and even sports. Behind it all is the building of an unbreakable coalition with France, one of the most power-wielding nations of the European Union, to complete President Moon's journey to peace on the divided peninsula. Shin Se-min, Arirang News, Paris.
Now, joining us today, we have Dr. James Kim, a research fellow from the ASEM Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So perhaps what was not explicitly stated in that previous report was what President Moon said about the North Korean sanctions. He said, let me quote here, "We must further encourage North Korea's denuclearization process by easing UN sanctions when and if we decide the North's denuclearization process has at least reached a point of no return." So he's put a bit of a disclaimer on easing sanctions, but it's perhaps the strongest call for this lifting of sanctions that we've seen so far. What is your reaction to these statements?
Well, given that there's a lot of talk about the extent to which South Korea is coordinating with the United States, and the U.S. government recently, both the State Department and the Treasury coming out, reaffirming its commitment to enforcing existing sanctions. This was a big bet, another big move by President Moon. Some might even say daredevil kind of an act, if not a move. Let's see how this works out. But the international community has fairly strict standards about what they're expecting to see from North Korea. And there's a history of bilateral and multilateral negotiations involving North Korea. So I think that he'll find that the reaction from the international community, especially from the European counterparts, may be even further to the right from where he wants to be in comparison to the United States. But again, we'd have to wait and see how this plays out.
Let's take a look at France President Macron's reaction to this first and the press conference. Now, he said in response directly, he said, "We are ready to fulfill every mission to give us and a permanent member of we are ready to fill every mission given to us as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to realize complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Now, that's not quite as strong as what Moon perhaps might have wanted from what he said as well. There's a bit of speculation that President Moon might have wanted President Macron to give more leeway on that. But it seems fair that France is not quite ready yet.
There's really nothing that South Korea can offer France in terms of getting France closer to its position on the North Korean nuclear issue. In fact, in my view, there's absolutely no leverage here. So he can make an appeal for this process, and I think the French president would say that he supports a peaceful resolution to this issue. But the standard here is fairly similar to how it was under President Obama and previous administration in the United States. So again, I think that what this shows is that France is signaling to President Moon that there's a higher bar here, and it's not quite ready yet unless North Korea is willing to show something more, a more concrete commitment towards denuclearization.
So as you've mentioned, President Moon has brought up the topic of easing sanctions on a global stage now. It seems like he'll be probably taking the similar message to it when he meets other European leaders this week. We've just heard that he'll be meeting with Theresa May, Angela Merkel, among others. But he seems to be, as you said, fight against the tide. You called it a daredevil move, perhaps. But what is the thinking behind this? And do you think he'll be able to have any kind of progress towards what he wants to achieve as well?
Right. I think there's at least two strategies or concerns here that are guiding President Moon and pushing him towards this path. One is obviously he's laying the groundwork to get the Europeans on board if the United States is able to make a deal with North Korea with the second summit that President Trump is scheduled to have with Kim Jong-un. If something substantive comes out of that meeting, then we can move forward with the United States on easing sanctions. But again, on the UN Security Council resolutions, you need to have unanimous support of the permanent 5 members. That includes France and UK. So he needs to tee them up in order to, if there is a deal come later this year or earlier next year, that he can move towards easing of sanctions in coordination with the United States. The second motive could possibly be that he could be trying to rally the international community, even the members of the Security Council in the UN, to try to push the United States to move faster towards a deal with North Korea. And if he was able to convince President Macron, or even for that matter, Prime Minister May, on board with his proposal of making these concessions towards North Korea, maybe he thought that he could try to get the UK and France on board to try to push the United States to get a deal with the North Koreans. So there are two, I think, motives here. In my view, I think he's exploring them more so than he's actually embarking on that path.
But as you said, it is a big gamble. I mean, there is the risk that, President Moon might end up with egg on his face, especially if North Korea does, this back record of not fulfilling its promises. It's a big risk, wouldn't you say? Yeah,
or he got a cold shoulder from President Macron on this proposal. So he's already, in some ways, a bit discouraged. But so it's an uphill battle for him. So there's a lot of work to do.
Meanwhile, a U.S. State Department spokesperson has said they expect all UN member states to fully implement North Korean sanctions. And the spokesperson actually quoted President Moon himself, saying the improvement of relations between North and South Korea cannot advance separately from resolving North Korea's nuclear problem. Now, this comes after, of course, the two Koreas held high-level talks on Monday and agreed to further works towards connecting the rail and road networks and have a groundbreaking ceremony later this year as well. The US State Department statement seems to be expressing reservations about what some of Seoul is doing. How serious do you think these reservations are?
I'm not sure that this message is really specifically targeted to Seoul only. I think there's concern in the State Department with the de facto loosening of sanctions, and we're hearing some reports of that already in China and Russia. And there are possible loopholes here with the inter-Korean cooperation. And so I think what the State Department is signaling is that all parties, including South Korea, if it chooses to engage with North Korea, must be careful and not, violating existing sanctions regime. So I think it's really a statement that the U.S. is committed to its pressure campaign while it is engaging with North Korea.
U.S. President Donald Trump himself has said, he said North Korea is coming along very well. He said relationships are good. I think a lot of good things will happen. How do we reconcile what he said with what some of the U.S. State Department has done, emphasizing sanctions, ratcheting up pressure on North Korea?
So there are two possible explanations here and two hypotheses. We would probably never know because without getting in President Trump's head, we won't really know what the intention is. One explanation, obviously, is that President Trump simply being honest and true to his policy of pressure plus engagement with North Korea. So while on the one hand, the pressure is being applied by the state and Treasury, on the other hand, he is working the diplomatic route and trying to engage with North Korea in a more effective basis to reach a deal. The second explanation here is that there's potentially a gap between the relevant agencies that are involved in enforcing these sanctions at the working level versus the White House. The White House has different ideas about how to push forward with North Korea, and State Department and Treasury has its own ideas about how to do that. Again, which one of these hypotheses are right? It's not clear for me to say, but if the latter is true, then simply getting a deal through a summit is not going to be enough in getting that agreement to stick, as we saw after the Singapore summit. Again, there's a lot of work here on all sides that needs to be done. And for the United States, there are some questions that needs to be asked. But if North Korea comes forward in an earnest way towards denuclearizing, then I don't think we need to worry about any of this, right?
Okay. So, well, some of those details you talked about on the working level, it was hoped that this new special representative on North Korea that the US have picked, Stephen Biegun, it was hoped that he would be able to work out some of the details with their North Korean counterparts and have a meeting in Vienna soon. That's what the US said previously. But now they're saying he'll be visiting Moscow, Paris and Brussels for working level talks with those counterparts. But there's no word on a North Korean meeting yet. I mean, what signal does that suggest? I mean, is that a concern that there is no movement towards working out with North Korea?
Well, one is that it takes two to dance. And simply because Steve Biegun is moving doesn't necessarily mean that the North Koreans are moving in tandem with the North Korean representative at the State Department. So it's not clear to me where the two sides are in order for a meeting to take place. Again, we'll have to see how this plays out in order for us to get there. But there are two reasons I could think of why Steve Biegun would be making these rounds to these other countries. First is again, as I've said before, there's a concern in the State Department about sustained pressure on sanctions. And it's a multilateral effort when we're talking about sanctions. And so he needs to make sure that everybody's on the same page with respect to participating in the existing sanctions regime, regardless of what happens on the diplomatic front with North Korea. So to get some sort of a consensus, to build a consensus, to tighten the screw around the multilateral effort towards pressuring North Korea to come out more earnestly to the bargaining table. Second is that after a deal is reached, you need to have all relevant stakeholders have a buy-in into that deal in order for that agreement to stick. And this involves countries like China, Russia, Japan, And if he's making rounds to Paris, he's clearly thinking about the Security Council as well. Again, this needs to be a multilateral effort, even though the negotiations are happening bilaterally. I think there's a sophisticated understanding here at the State Department that for many reasons, for keeping the sanctions in place, and also at the same time making sure that if an agreement is reached, that it stays in place, that the U.S. works multilaterally with many countries on this issue outside of just North and South Korea.
Well, I think that's where we're going to have to wrap things up. Thank you for coming on the show, and it's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, that concludes our show. I'll be back tomorrow with more breakdowns and analysis of the day's top stories. Thank you for watching, and hope you can join us again next time. Goodbye.
Ghent, the city of free-whelming charm created by the blend of art and culture. Music, the free form of art. The world I see becomes the lyrics.
Having again my favorite dream. I want you, baby, want you. Reasons I cannot explain. There's some part of me wants to see Graceland.
The freeness of my soul becomes the melody. The music I make, the way nature orders me and the way time flows is spontaneous, but not artificial. Free, but not frivolous.